Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Monty Solberg, and welcome to the New West Public Affairs Budget 2021 webinar. Budget 2021 was delivered this afternoon by Finance Minister Travis Toews. The revenue top line and the deficit bottom line are always important, but just as important is what's between the lines, and very much between the lines. And the biggest story of the year, of course, is the COVID-19 outbreak, which has affected Alberta and the world. 132,000 Albertans have contracted the virus. It has claimed 1,866 lives in this province. We invite you to participate in today's webinar. So thank you to all of you who are online viewing this right now. You can put your questions in the Q&A section of your Zoom link. To help us sort through Budget 2021, we have members of the New West team, Matt Solberg, Sonia Kant, Michael Solberg, and Keith McLaughlin. So the budget came down just a little over an hour and a half ago. Matt, why don't you start us off, your impressions of Budget 2021 and your thoughts on the first pieces of legislation, which have just been released as well, part of the new legislative calendar.
Sure. So I think Budget 2021 is a budget that nobody really wanted, but it's one that we needed. There's $18 billion in deficit for this year, so down somewhat from last year, but obviously still an enormous challenge for the province. But with that, we see some increased spending for healthcare and accounting of all of the COVID measures that they unveiled over this past year. And then some, very targeted areas of investment and areas to support business. So I think that there's going to be a general feeling that, maybe this is not what folks had wanted in a perfect year. There's, the timeline to balance is certainly not front and center as a focus. But rather, as the Premier said, it would be supporting lives and livelihoods. So I think there will be generally some people that are satisfied with supports that are funded throughout the budget. But of course, there's going to be a lot of people that feel left out as well.
So it's a very different tone than we've seen in some of the budgets that come down from this government, Premier Kenney and Minister Toews. Why don't we go to Keith and then we'll go to Sonia and we'll let Michael wrap it up. Keith, your thoughts on this budget?
Thanks, Monty. Yeah, I mostly agree with Matt. I think this budget is the path of least resistance budget for the UCP. It's by their standards, I think it's safe when you look back at their platform and what they wanted to accomplish in terms of deficit reduction and all those other matters when it came to eliminating the deficits that have been plaguing Alberta for the last decade. So there's not as much cuts here as the UCP would have probably wanted to do, say 2 years ago. But there are still cuts. Post-secondary education, agriculture, and justice are taking some haircuts, and most notably, public sector compensation is going to be declining by, I believe, 4% in this budget. So how the government is going to do that, we've heard rumblings about potential for wage rollbacks. Looks like they're going to try to do this at the negotiating table, but it'll be very interesting to see how they accomplish the public sector compensation rollbacks that they built into the budget this calendar year.
Sonia, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Monty. I think if I had to describe this budget 2021, it would be measured and expected. I think majority of Albertans, if you did a poll of them, majority of them would say, I want my budget focused on healthcare and getting us out of COVID-19. And I think that's exactly what the government did. I think they kind of read the room in different regions of the province and based their budget, their decision and policy making on this. Like Matt said, and Keith also mentioned, there are some cuts in different sectors, including ag and justice, but I think those are perhaps ambitious of ministers themselves trying to find efficiencies and red tape reductions. But overall, I think this budget would be kind of a disappointment to the NDP. I think there's a lot less to critique from this than the previous one. As my colleague Matt said, it's a safe budget for the UCP. I think they can focus on getting through COVID and perhaps, as Minister Taves said, getting back on track to balancing the budget, which majority of their base wants the government to be focused on in 2022.
Okay, Michael.
Yeah, thanks, Dad. So I agree with my colleagues, but I think one thing that I'll maybe take a different kind of outlook on is I think that this budget is ambitious, not necessarily in the financial outlook or the numbers that they're banking on. We've seen kind of mistakes in the past. I mean, the last budget was tabled just prior to COVID kind of coming onto the shores of Alberta, had very ambitious royalty revenue targets. I don't mean ambitious in that sense. I mean ambitious in the terms of the way that it's going to have to communicate this to regular Albertans. To Sonia's point, I think that regular people have expected a lean budget. The Premier has been very open about the fact that they have to tackle this deficit and that it's ballooned as a result of the public health response and of the price war, the Saudi-Russia price war, and the effects that had on royalty revenues. But it needs to be communicated at this point in the mandate in a way that provides and kind of inspires some hope and optimism that the Premier has his steady hand at the wheel, and that the programs and areas that he has chosen to cut are for the greater good, that he's moving towards a budget balance, which I think many Albertans see as important, while at the same time investing enough in people and in the economy that is going to create jobs and diversify the economy and bring this province back to prosperity, not just to pre-COVID, but in a way that is stronger than the economy was before.
Okay, thanks, Mike. We've got some questions coming in, which is great. We've got people speculating about the future of the Premier and that kind of thing. Next question I want to ask you about really sort of ties into all of that. Personally, I don't think the Premier has much to worry about right now, but be very curious to know how this is going to go over with the cabinet, the caucus, stakeholders, general public. Sonia, why don't you start us off and sort of talk about that a little bit?
Sure, absolutely. I think if I had to guess, majority of caucus would be in favor of this. I think they understand that they have to support the leader on just getting through COVID-19 and then focusing on the other platform promises, including trying to settle down and get the finances under control and develop a plan for reducing the debt and balancing the budget. I think what you'll find that majority of the cabinet will be in line in terms of messaging and supporting this budget. I know they'll be going back to their constituencies next week. They'll be tasked with that challenge and going to their own stakeholders and their constituents and selling this budget to them. Of course, you're going to have a few probably rural Alberta MLAs. I think you folks will probably know a few names on who those may be, including Drew Barnes. I think he may not see this as a conservative budget. I think you're going to see groups like CTF coming out that this is not conservative enough, that we need to cut more spending in health, although the government of Alberta increased spending. So it'll be really interesting to see where MLAs sit on this. I think they've also just got the budget. They're probably analyzing. What I'm really interested in knowing is the capital projects. And I think the government increased it by $1.5 billion or so. So they're sitting at 8.2 billion for this year alone. And I'm sure every MLA from all corners of Alberta will be fighting for some money to build bridges, fix roads, and do any infrastructure work in their ridings.
Well, thanks, Sonia. I mean, the challenge, I think, for the minister is, on the one hand, to try and maintain the course on gradually reducing that deficit. And they have it projected to go from 20 to 18 to 11 to 8 over the next 4 years. But the minister has declined, of course, to actually state a date by which he'd balance the budget. And in the meantime, they continue to, spend in certain areas to make sure the economy continues on through a time when the economy is largely closed down still because of COVID-19. Keith, Your thoughts on how stakeholders, caucus, et cetera, are going to react to this?
I think in large part, if you're looking at it from a sort of a stakeholder perspective, it depends on who you are. And when Michael was talking earlier about an ambitious economic plan, there's references to a multitude of economic strategies in this budget document about diversification. So that talks about tech, it talks about driving down emissions, it talks about ESG, and kind of changing the narrative around Alberta's energy sector, and obviously all of these new technologies, low carbon innovations, and et cetera, that the government's going to pursue. So, there's a lot of that in there. Obviously, if you're other stakeholders, you're seeing cutbacks in arts and recreation centers and things like that. So it really depends on who you are. But there's enough in this budget for, I think, folks looking forward on the diversification agenda, not so much on things like arts, culture, municipalities, and public sector sort of focused economic activity.
So, Michael, Sonia put her finger on the challenges around the caucus. The caucus is, I think it's safe to say, pretty divided, certainly on some issues, certainly on things like restrictions, but not just restrictions, a big rural-urban split. Talk about that a little bit. And then Matt, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question, Dad. And I think politically, it's probably the most important issue facing Premier Kenney right now, and will be going into 2023. It's an enormously difficult task to walk that tightrope between appealing to your base, which is, in strongest in the rural parts of the province, while it's at the same time remaining a viable option and popular, or at least somewhat popular, so to speak, with kind of the softer moderates, mostly in Calgary. I think Edmonton's virtually a lost cause at this point. Maybe the Premier doesn't see it that way, but the battleground to me is shaping up certainly to be Calgary, which it often is. And the Premier does have a tall order and a tall task ahead of him in ensuring that he keeps his base happy, avoiding a fracturing on the right, which has tended to happen with these parties. The most recent example, of course, being the Wild Rose splintering off from the PCs in 2012 and earlier. So it's going to be a difficult task for him. He's going to have to work closely with municipalities, and he's going to have to work very closely with his MLAs, ensure he's delivering wins for them, listening to their concerns, and coming to a consensus where possible.
So, Matt, you've worked on both the PCs and with Wild Rose, starting out with Wild Rose, and then serving with Premier Kenney in the last election campaign. What's your take on how strongly those views of sort of being disaffected are in rural Alberta?
Well, I think that those views are quite strong. I think you can see that in much of the polling that we've seen over the last year, that there is a divide, and I think it is primarily falling on the urban-rural split. But I also don't think that this budget was necessarily designed as the prescription for all of those problems, and I think it was wise not to attempt to with a single budget. The focus here being very much on COVID and getting us through the pandemic and providing the supports that people need to get through that okay. But there are other mechanisms available to this government that I expect they will use to try and shore up support. The first two bills on the government's order paper for the session, I think, are designed to, especially for that. You've got a Citizen Initiative Act, which will essentially provide a mechanism for Albertans to come up with their own questions for a referendum to put to the province. And then, of course, the much talked about Recall Act. And both of those, I think, are a bit of a nod to the Wild Rose kind of corner of the party, the sort of that populist, that prairie populist group that we know can be quite vocal and quite, they can play a significant role in conservative parties in this province. So I don't think that this is going to satisfy everybody, nor do I think it was designed that way. But I think when you look at this in the current context of where we are in February 2021 and the pandemic we're dealing with, I think that even some of those rural MLAs who would have liked to see an accelerated path to balance will have a tough time making that argument to constituents who are really just trying to keep the lights on when jobs are not plentiful.
So this is a bit of I guess, a carry forward of the same discussion. We're halfway through the mandate right now. We've got this budget coming down in the middle of a worldwide pandemic. The government has been sitting low in the polls. There's concern, obviously, in the UCP ranks. I guess the big question is, does this budget start to pivot the government towards success? They've been in all these fights with key stakeholders, the doctors and some of the public sector unions and all kinds of other people. This very much to me looks like, they're trying to play nice with all kinds of groups right now. Just curious whether this gets them on track to win enough support to have a shot at winning in the next election. So let's see here. Why don't we start? Michael, why don't we start with you this time?
Sure. Thanks, Dad. And you hit the nail on the head. That has been something that has, I think at the time seemed like they had the political capital to spend. They were not yet halfway into the mandate. There was not COVID at the time. The Premier did decide to double down on a couple of those conflicts. And COVID ultimately quieted a number of them as everyone's attention turned to more important things. But the question, like you asked, is this budget signaling a pivot in the way that the Premier kind of conducts his stakeholder management? I hope so. And it seems like it is. He does need to start courting large swaths of important stakeholders and important pieces of the electorate, some of whom he was waging a war with only a year ago, like you said, teachers, doctors, et cetera. He's increased public health spending. The doctor fight is quieting. The public unions will always have a beef with, I think, a conservative premier, and they certainly won't be happy about these public sector cuts. But you have to understand, and I think all of us who know the premier and have been watching him over his career understands that he very much is in tune with his political calculus. I think he feels like he can afford to do some of the things that he's doing. And he'll certainly have more up his sleeve as we see the months continue to wage on.
Okay, Sonia, what do you think of all of this? Is this a pivot towards success for the government?
In a way it is, Monty. I think it's kind of a not too political of a budget in my opinion. I think over the last 2 years, like my colleague Michael just stated, Premier was seen to be kind of at war with many different groups, including doctors, nurses, teachers. I think he's hoping that this budget kind of calms everybody down. He's put in significant capital money into this budget and supporting healthcare, for example. They've seen almost $1 billion increase in their budget. Even with the education budget, it's been the same as last year, so nothing's changing there. So hopefully, I think he's hoping that teachers and those public sector workers are happy there. I think the other thing with this budget is, again, is focusing on what Albertans expect their government to be focused, and that's on getting through COVID-19, coming up with a good recovery plan, and also focusing on and investing in other sectors other than oil and gas. In the budget, it's interesting to see other new things come up, including aviation. I believe that's a signal that they'll bring more efficiency and faster service to the government sectors, and a lot of good investment also into agricultural as well. So I think this is a good budget. It will keep the government on track. And of course, we'll see in October, there'll be kind of the partisan issues and platform pieces come out, including referendum and recall in the Senate election stuff, which in this budget, actually, they're giving about $10 million in October to conduct those referendum ideas.
Everybody has a lot of great things to say, but I'm just going to ask ask you all to be a bit more succinct. We've got a lot of questions coming in from the audience, and we've got a lot of ground to cover. So let's just quickly go through this. Matt, is this a pivot to success for the government of Alberta?
I think it's a pivot to ground that they would rather fight battles on. I think that when conservatives are dealing with a major healthcare crisis, which I think we can describe COVID-19 as, it's not a winning ground for them. I think when they're talking about economic growth, when they're talking about getting some order to the province's fiscal policy, and just to strengthening sort of the budgetary framework, I think those are all winning issues for this government. And I think that this helps them down that road. There are going to be some tough discussions to come. I think it's clear that there will be a discussion on revenue. This budget alone will not get us there unless, of course, we see another surprising bump in our energy sector and in the price of oil, and a prolonged bump. Otherwise, we will be having some tougher conversations about revenue. But I do think that in the short term, this does put them on a better ground.
Over to you, Keith.
This budget doesn't change the political dynamics that the government is facing. So it doesn't turn the corner, but it realistically, that couldn't be achieved anyways through this budget. But I think it needs to be, stated how precarious the political position is of the government right now. It's been a bad 5 months for them. So this is why this budget it's for them, I think, the right call. It's the path of least resistance budget. They are not animating too many stakeholders outside of the public sector who, as I think one of my colleagues pointed out, is not a fan of the government anyways. So what was really going to come down to how this government performs going into 2023 in the next election is, does the economy recover? And if the economy does not recover, and public services suffer, and the deficits are still large, then the government's going to have a continued political problem. But for that, this was the right, safe budget to do at this point in time. It's not. They still have a long way to go to improve their political fortunes, which are in large part going to be tied to the economy in 22 and 23.
And I think part of the answer, of course, is getting vaccines in arms. We have a question coming in from an anonymous attendee. Does this budget help or hurt get vaccines in arms smoothly? Well, it's certainly one of the themes of this budget. And it will really be up to, the government of Alberta to implement. It's one thing to talk about it, but it's quite another to implement. It's, something no government has dealt with in our lifetime, a situation where you have to muster all the resources that you have to put into a program like vaccinating ultimately 4.4 million Albertans. And I think it remains to be seen whether or not this budget is successful in getting those vaccines into arms smoothly. To answer the question, one question somebody's asked is about whether or not we can ever hope to balance the budget without a sales tax. The Premier poured cold water on the whole idea after the Business Council of Alberta floated the proposal again. And of course, this has been floated many times in the past. Premier has said, I think his remarks were, this is the worst possible time to talk about a sales tax, which I think is a fair point. But what about over the longer run? Are we ever going to see that? Let's see here. Why don't we ask Keith to jump in? And again, quickly, everybody, just jump in and comment on sales tax, and then let's move on to some other questions.
So the only point that I'll make on this right now is to say that no, Alberta does need a sales tax. I've had the privilege of being in the rooms with the officials from Treasury Board and Finance when the premiers and ministers are being briefed on this subject. And I know the advice from the officials in the bureaucracy is not changing. Alberta has a structural deficit. We can get our spending in line, as the UCP is going to do, with comparator provinces, and that will occur in about 2 years. And we're still going to have a $5 billion hole to fill. So no, we need a PST. It's a matter of time. It's going to have to happen.
I think we're gonna have a fight between our panelists here. Matt, why don't you comment on that?
Well, I mean, whether or not we can argue the merits of a PST, and I think that is something that is going to happen. I think that's something that the premier and the finance minister have said very clearly. We'll have that conversation. But the other part of this that we're forgetting is there is a strong, solid commitment from this government to respect the principles of the Taxpayer Protection Act, requiring a referendum before a PST is brought in. And looking ahead to 2023, perhaps that is on the ballot for 2023, is that referendum. And maybe that is the campaign that the premier wants to run, is with that as a wedge issue.
And just to remind everyone, in the McKinnon report, the government argued they could save $10.4 billion simply by bringing spending into line with the comparator provinces like Quebec, Ontario, and British Columbia. So that will be, the first thing they do. And of course, they're going to hope and pray that oil prices stay strong. I think they pegged oil at around $40 a barrel, which is a low ball, certainly from where it is today. WTI is over $60. And of course, when oil and gas prices and bitumen prices are high, the revenues flow into the Alberta coffers. So that's important. So let's talk about, whether or not there were any surprises in the budget. I think it was Sonia commented on sort of the aviation policy, which we haven't heard much about, but any other surprises that people took note of, messaging, tone, programs, that kind of thing? Michael, why don't we start with you on that?
Sure. I mean, admittedly, we're still kind of going through the budget with a fine-tooth comb, but one of the things that jumped out at me right away was enormous investments in tourism and in the hospitality sector, trying to revive that back to stronger than it ever was before. And they preserved their earlier commitments to double the size of the tourism industry by 2030. And it's mentioned repeatedly, not just in its own right, but as an important plank in economic diversification and in the economic recovery. So that, includes the growth of the film and television industry, which we've seen Minister Schweitzer repeatedly profile over the past few months, and hospitality and growing hotel and lodging. It's an interesting commitment just because of the size. There's been an enormous commitment to growing that sector by investing in Tourism Alberta and Invest Alberta, and recognizing it, like I said, as a big piece of this government's plan to bring the province back to track. All
right, Matt, would you like to comment?
Sure. I don't know if it's necessarily a surprise, because government has slowly been, I think, increasing the amount they talk about this, but there is a significant focus on ESG within the budget and within the business plans. And I think it's an acknowledgement that it's, the Alberta government needs to talk the language of business when it comes to ESG. For a long time, I think there was an aversion, maybe not to making the policy decisions that are in line with those goals, but in reflecting the kind of language that people use to describe that kind of investment. That is in there. That is in there as a key priority of this government. And in fact, one of the Premier's key confidants and former principal advisor in the Premier's office, David Knight-Legg, is the chair of the ESG working group for the province. So I think it's a sign that they will be taking this very seriously, and they will also be taking the storytelling aspect of Alberta's policies quite seriously in an effort to profile our efforts on ESG.
Keith, do you want to comment?
No, thank you.
Okay, Sonia.
Just on, I guess this is not really a big sector surprise that I found in the budget, but again, on the $10 million allocated for the referendum and the Senate election coming up. I always wonder if that's kind of pandered to some of our rural Alberta voters. I don't know if it is, if it's not, but I find that really interesting. I think you'll find a lot of people speaking up against that, including journalists, which I already saw on Twitter today, and perhaps the NDP questioning that money spent on a referendum coming up in October.
Well, I think it's true. If you go through this document, there's a lot of rhetoric in the budget that's directed against Ottawa, first of all, which plays well, I think, to the Conservative base. And you can find many examples of that. We saw it directly from Minister Taves in his budget speech, where he was sharply critical of the Trudeau government in Ottawa. And then you see, if you go through the document, I mean, there are pages dedicated to concern about the so-called No More Pipelines bill and many other pieces of federal legislation. I think I really get the feeling a lot of this budget is designed to appeal to rural Alberta. And on that note, let's talk about something that matters a lot to the Conservative base, and that's the deficit. The deficit this year projected to be $20 billion, $18 billion for 2021, 2022, and then falling to 11, and then finally 8. That's a long ways away from being balanced. We've had a pandemic in the meantime, of course, since the original 2019 promise was made. So the question is, Matt, tell us, does the deficit matter politically very much anymore, especially right now? What do you think?
I would say right now, no. And I say that because there's not an election this year. I think in 2023, it will matter. There is a big segment of the United Conservative Party that take pride in sort of strong fiscal stewardship. They take pride in the years in which Alberta was a so-called debt-free province. But at this point, the number one focus being today, and this is a budget designed to get us through today, I don't think it matters. But the other aspect of this it's kind of lost in this budget specifically is the trend line on spending. We are getting to a place where we're slowly moving closer towards the average spending we see in comparator provinces. We're not there yet. I saw a tweet from Trevor Tombe, U of C economist, who is referring to the spending trajectory we're on, and that if we continue on this path, then it's, I think, around 2024, 25, we will be on par with other provinces. Yet we would still have, I believe it was a $7 billion deficit, which is where the question comes in. In the past, governments have relied on royalties to make that up. I think that, gambling on that is becoming a riskier and riskier endeavor. And so again, the deficit will matter, but I do think that some of these other questions and conversations that we have not yet had will maybe matter more, and that includes the revenue mix.
Well, very much the government has put the emphasis in this budget on getting people back to work and getting vaccines rolled out. Keith, your thoughts on, how important a deficit is right now in terms of politics, and what the chances are that will be a major issue going into the next election campaign.
It's a really interesting question, partly because the Premier's tone on his discussion about the deficit and debt in particular really changed this week. He is now talking about, and I think rightfully so, the debt to GDP ratio, and that they're signaling to the bond markets that we are going to keep our debt to GDP ratio at 33%. This is actually the same language that the federal Liberals use when they're talking about the federal deficit. From a state financing perspective, it's correct. And so the Premier, when it comes to the politics of it, deficit reduction is important to the Premier, and it's important to the UCP, and it's important to Conservatives in this province. But it's a politically perilous road because as we've talked about, without revenue measures, you can basically just dismantle public services in this province and try to get yourself to balance. But good luck with that politically, because Albertans, they want a balanced budget, but they also like their public services. Former Premier Prentice had that famous quote, "Look in the mirror," started a cascading series of errors of that PC campaign that ultimately lost that government the election. but Albertans pretty much have come to realize that, yeah, Prentice was right. And they're slowly more and more becoming to realize that. So, you can't do this just all by cutting spending on healthcare and education in particular. And you will have problems in Calgary and Edmonton in particular if you do this thing. So politically perilous path, very interested to see how they move forward on it.
Well, I think that's going to be very much in dispute whether or not, this matters a lot to people, or whether deficits matter a lot or will matter a lot in 18 months. Michael, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, just briefly, I think Keith and Matt did a great job on covering most of it. I just want to point out that Alberta, at least according to most polls, we seem to be the only province that still cares about deficits. Most other provinces do not poll in a manner where people seem to spend a lot of time worrying about the bottom line in terms of budget. They care more about how things are spent, but less about what the deficit actually looks like. And that's been true for a long time. And I think it will be true again in 2023. The New Democrats, they're the progressive party in this province. They care about the budget deficit. And they were making steps to reduce it as well during their time in office. And I think it's a universal truth here in Alberta, and will continue to be that way.
Sonia, just briefly, and then we'll go to some of the comments and questions coming in from the audience.
Sure. Thanks, Machi. I think everybody's right here that if you probably polled Albertans right now at this time, the deficit probably wouldn't be their top issue, probably not even top 5 in my opinion. But if you kind of narrow that down and polled UCP members, Premier Kenney's base, it would be on their top 5. But I think it'd be a little unrealistic to even talk about balancing the budget now. You even heard Minister Chafe say it's something that was a priority of the government, but it's kind of on hold. They're trying to get through this storm of COVID-19, trying to vaccinate people and get people back to work. But I think it'll be a recurring issue that will come at policy conventions that will be on top of many MLAs, especially in rural Alberta, who kind of come from the Wild Rose wing of the party. It's not going to die anytime soon. And of course, you're going to have groups like CTF pounding the premier on where is a plan, when are you going to make some cuts and balance the books. So I don't think it's an issue that's going to go anytime soon.
Well, this is the fundamental problem. The premier is getting squeezed between his party and, of course, the general public. And the party is very much divided, I think, on these things. And it's a good point, Sonia. Thanks for raising it. We have a few MLAs on the line, and I see Richard Gottfried, great Calgary MLA, has made the point that he has a private members bill that initiated the Strategic Aviation Advisory Council. I think it is something that made its way into the budget this time. Sonia, you already mentioned it. This is part of the government's overall diversification strategy, to very publicly not move away from oil and gas, because oil and gas is still very much, a foundational part of the Alberta economy. It accounts for about 25% of the economy. So it's, we can't do without it. But there's no question the government is pivoting, and whether it's aeronautics, tourism, technology, there's all kinds of things they're getting into. One of the things that I think is really interesting is this discussion over pharma and bio life sciences. There's a bit of a race, I think, amongst different jurisdictions to ensure that they have manufacturers for vaccines. I've had people calling me saying, we need this capacity in Alberta. The budget stopped short of committing to anything like that, of course. But just thoughts from the panel, I guess, on the opportunities in diversification and to what degree this should be about, Alberta creating funds, offering incentives, and that kind of thing, which is quite different than the approach that the government has taken up until now. So why don't we start, Matt, why don't you start and respond to that?
Well, I think the premier made it clear. I think it was yesterday where he said that now is the time for targeted investments. And I think we're seeing that in a number of different sectors within this budget. Just looking at my notes here, I mean, yeah, there's big focus on strategic aviation and aeronautics, pharma and life sciences. They also have 28 million set aside for geothermal development and research. I mean, I think at this point they're hoping that anyone and probably all of these sectors take off. You know, this isn't an abandonment of the traditional oil and gas sector. In fact, I saw within the government's assumptions that they expect oil sands oil to play a greater role over the next few years in terms of the percentage of global oil use. So it's not turning from one sector to the other, but I think it really is a way of targeting what they believe to be growth areas that are most likely to produce jobs and you know, incentivize economic growth.
So Michael, pardon me, touched on the on tourism. There's no question that the hardest hit sector in the Alberta economy has to be tourism and hospitality. You know, there's a massive potential, I think, to expand that industry and get it back. First of all, get it back on its feet, and that is really one of the stated goals of the budget, which is to get people back to work, and you know, as restrictions lift, get people back into the economy. You know, is there enough on that in this budget? To me, it seems like it's something that ultimately could be a vote getter and something that could, you know, be very, very popular if some of these programs are actually effective. Michael, why don't you start?
Yeah, no, absolutely, Dad. Agreed on all fronts. Execution and implementation will be crucial, and that'll be the measure of success. But they need to go after the low-hanging fruit, and the simple solution to get people back to work is widespread vaccination of working class people. And before we can do that, we have to vaccinate our most vulnerable. You know, while these programs and these targeted investments, to Matt's point, are important, and they're in the budget, and I'm sure every minister and their officials have every intention of implementing them, we have to get people vaccinated first before any of these programs will be effective. So don't be surprised if that remains the number one top priority of virtually every minister and Premier Kenny's cabinet for the foreseeable future. And by that, I mean at least the next 6 months, probably more like 12. So it will be interesting to see how they're able to kind of dovetail wanting to get to work right away on creating some economic activity, while at the same time having to wait for additional vaccines and to roll out vaccines widespread across the population.
So we just had the Prime Minister in a meeting with President Biden talking about a continental climate change policy or continental climate change initiatives. Alberta is definitely going to want to be at the table. I didn't catch whether or not that was addressed anywhere in the budget documents in the short period that I had to review them. Any thoughts on, you know, let's go to Keith on that. Keith, any thoughts on how Alberta can exploit that and, you know, fully take advantage? I mean, there's some things they're doing under the natural gas strategy. Go ahead and sort of talk about where the opportunities lie.
There's a lot in there, Monty. I guess this is just to start, you know, a bilateral climate sort of policy between Canada and the United States is not going to rely on the US Congress because it's impossible to get climate legislation through the US Senate the way it's kind of constructed right now, and even the House of Representatives would be difficult. So it's going to have to be executive kind of action on the part of the United States and regulatory action through the EPA, which they can actually do a lot of. You know, Alberta does, I think it does need to adjust some of its language when it comes to how it's approaching these issues. I see a comment there that, you know, from a listener that industry is pivoting, government is not. Industry is pivoting. The government of Alberta is pivoting too, but you won't know it if you just listen to what you hear on the news. They downplay a lot of the great work that the Alberta government is doing on reducing emissions, on energy diversification within our existing energy resources to lower the carbon intensity, improve the ESG and all of that. But instead, you've got these blunders that take up the airwaves, like the War Room, which has resulted, it's $120 million over 4 years. It's probably resulted in more bad press in terms of millions of dollars of bad press than that already for the government of Alberta. So, Alberta is actually doing a lot of these things, and I think it would behoove the province if we actually started downplaying and some of the rhetoric about, blaming political actions for what's happening in an energy transition in the global economy from partisan opponents, and actually start to embrace the energy transition a bit more, because we're doing it anyways. Alberta is doing it, and we're going to help lead this, and we're going to help develop a sustainable pathway through these low carbon innovations for our resources. And we should talk more about that in a positive way, and we're not doing it.
So some straight talk there from Keith. Matt, we've got all kinds of initiatives in the natural gas strategy: plastics, recycling, LNG, carbon capture, utilization, storage, hydrogens, and small modular reactors. Just as an example, is there an opportunity in working with the Biden government and the federal government to get some things done, despite sort of the hot rhetoric directed toward the federal government?
I think absolutely there is. And in fact, prior to the decision that President Biden made on Keystone, we'd heard the government of Alberta talk about, an interest in pursuing a sort of a joint North American energy security strategy. And of course, when you're talking energy security, you're talking climate change. You're talking about all of these issues. They're all intertwined now. Not just in terms of politics, but in the way that businesses are making decisions. So I do think there's going to be opportunity here. For example, some of the research being done into battery technology. I know that some of that is happening here in Alberta. There's funding, pockets of funding. You'll find it throughout this budget, designed to incentivize research. They've got the innovation capital grant, I believe, is what it's called, specifically to help support R&D here in Alberta. I think there's a lot of hope that focuses on emissions reduction technology. I could go on and list dozens of different initiatives designed to drive emissions down and to create Alberta-made technology. The one thing I will agree with Keith on is when it comes to the message that is heard, that is not typically what people are hearing from Alberta. And I think there is that disconnect. But when it comes to the programs funded within this budget, I think they're on the right track.
Sonia, do you want to comment, please?
Yeah, just a quick comment. I think this budget in particular, it's very ambitious in terms of targeting different sectors to diversify economy. And I think Michael previously also stated they're not backing away from oil and gas. Now the prices are going up. They are still generating revenue from that. But it's really good to see the government look at other ways, other opportunities and potential where a new business can come into Alberta. One of the bigger ones that I'm always interested to see is tech. I think Mr. Schweitzer has done a good job on highlighting that. He's really been a key spokesperson over the last few months for it. We've seen tremendous amount of, I think, good press on it, and I hope that continues. But even if you talk about tech goes in every other sector as well. We've seen it in forestry, we've seen it in energy, of course, with the geothermal stuff. So I'm really looking forward to seeing where tech leads in the next 2 years. And I sure hope the government invests a lot of time and energy into it, because it's looking like people are starting to look at it, and companies are finally moving to Alberta, especially Calgary, for it.
There seems to be a lot happening in the tech sector. Benevity received a major investment from a European investor, over $1 billion, one of Calgary's true unicorns, and there have been several other examples. One of the concerns I think that I've heard a few times is the government is doing so many things at once, and they're all designed, of course, to diversify the economy and create jobs and opportunity, that in some cases it may not be getting everything done in time. And I can say I would be somewhat concerned that some of these things aren't going to start to produce jobs and produce a real impact before the next election campaign. So this is one of the issues that I think people are concerned about. We can talk about that in a minute. But someone has asked a good question about whether or not Wexit is a real thing and whether or not the premier needs to worry about that. I mean, the premier wins some of these ridings, or the UCP wins some of these ridings going away. They win with 70-80% of the vote. Do they really need to worry about Wexit? And why don't we start, Michael, why don't we start with you?
Sure, I'll just speak briefly. I think Matt's probably better able to speak to this, just given his political background. I mean, Wexit in its reality, what it's looking to do, and ultimately, become its own entity. Alberta become its own entity. Of course, it's unrealistic. But is it a threat to Jason Kenney and particularly the rural parts of the province? Probably, and I think he thinks it is too. This is why he's had some rhetoric that's clearly throwing a bone and some red meat to these folks and trying to keep them happy and satisfied and feel like they're heard and understood. This is why he talks tough to Ottawa, but none of this is new. I mean, let's remember these types of sentiments are as old as Confederation, since
I think we may have lost Mike there. Maybe I'll jump in here.
Yeah, please.
So I agree. I do think Wexit is an issue. I think it's an issue for a few reasons. Politically, we've seen what a vote split on the right does to conservative parties in this province. The map we've already seen the map. It's 2015, and I do think that is certainly a possibility. But I also think even shorter term, the biggest risk with Wexit is the divided attention of government and of the premier. There's certainly a big segment of the party that wants to see things like the equalization referendum on the ballot this fall. But what does that do in terms of afterwards? And that's always been my concern is if Albertans vote overwhelmingly for equalization reform, will that be enough to satisfy the right sort of flank of this government and those who are pushing for independence, or are they going to want even more? And at some point, that is the concern. Does that completely fracture? So it's a real issue. I don't think we're any more clear with this budget on how that plays out. I think there's a lot of different factors that will be more impactful to that, including a potential federal election. So we'll have to wait and see on just how dangerous Wexit is.
Okay, Sonia, over to you. You'd like to comment on this?
Sure. I'll be brief just because we have a lot of questions coming in, Monty. I don't really see Wexit as a gigantic threat right now. I see it more of a distraction for both the premier caucus. I feel like it's kind of always in their face wherever they go, and they're always going out and explaining what they're doing in the government, etc., and the policies. But from experience, we all know even running a candidate for a political party, it requires a lot of money. It requires a credible leader, which they don't have at the moment in Alberta. It requires constituency associations, money, and etc. So I just don't think they have the infrastructure right now for it. I don't think they're a major threat in terms of even swinging votes right now. I see them more of a distraction from the government in conducting their duties and governing right now. That's all I see it as.
Okay, Keith, over to you.
Just quickly, I just think that Wexit is a threat, but not in rural Alberta, where Jason Nixon would win his riding, not with 89%, but say 80%. It's in Calgary. What happens if a separatist party takes 5% of the vote in Calgary? Well, that puts a lot more seats in play for the NDP. There's 26 seats in Calgary. The UCP own 23 of them. For the NDP to win the next election, they need to probably win at least 18 of them. That's huge. Huge swing in Calgary seats, but the numbers right now are looking like there's a potential for that. And if 5 points go away from the UCP in some of these ridings, like outside of Calgary's urban core and into the suburbs, that's a real problem if you're the UCP. So Wexit is not a problem for them in rural Alberta. They'll win those seats, but it's a problem for them in Calgary, where the election will be won and lost.
So we're talking about hard politics here, and somebody posed a question about whether or not Justin Trudeau is going to run against Jason Kenney in the next election, and whether or not Jason Kenney is going to run against Justin Trudeau. I think that's very often the story between Alberta and the federal government. It's often they need each other, and it's interesting. You know, there's an interesting dynamic right now. On the one hand, we know that Government of Alberta officials are working with the federal government on some important projects. For instance, the irrigation project in southern Alberta through the Canada Infrastructure Bank that will ensure that there will be all kinds of irrigation through southern Alberta. But I think the overall question of federal provincial dynamics is extraordinarily important. On the one hand, they do need each other as sort of political foes. I think it's safe to say they need each other in other ways too. Alberta produces 16% of the GDP for the federal government, or the revenues for the federal government, according to the budget documents that we just had a look at. That's a lot of money, and and the government needs to be careful it doesn't shut down that revenue. And on the other hand, the provincial government is certainly leaning on the federal government right now in many other respects in terms of attracting revenue to help through this COVID crisis. Let's talk a little bit about that, Keith. I've got you in front of the camera right now. Talk a little bit about, ways that maybe the governments can cooperate and get some things done for the people of Alberta.
Thanks, Monty. Yeah, I think that there's obviously a very interesting relationship and tension and almost political codependency where each can scapegoat each other between the Prime Minister and the Premier. So it's interesting, but they work well. I don't want to say that the Premier and the Prime Minister work well together, but I would say the Premier and the Finance Minister work well together. So Minister Freeland in particular, as Deputy Premier or Deputy Prime Minister, works with the Premier's office on a number of different files, and we know that the Premier's office is very ambitious and assertive in asserting Alberta's agenda. There's really no shortage of where Alberta and Canada can collaborate through items like the Canada Infrastructure Bank. There's a feasibility study going about building a rail to Banff. Passenger rail for that, for instance. The big irrigation district announcement, that's federal money, majority of it helping from the CIB. And quite frankly, I think the Premier and the Premier's office have a very good point to make to the federal government around the federal climate plan. The federal climate plan affects Alberta more than any other province. Alberta needs support for net zero technologies and accelerating the adoption of that and lessening the load on industry and Albertans to get there. And so I think the federal government has a responsibility to assist Alberta on meeting the federal climate targets. And I think there's an audience in the federal government that agrees that they share that responsibility. So politics aside, there's lots of ways that they can collaborate, and I hope that we get more done between Canada and Alberta in the next year.
Let's go to Matt, your comments.
Well, I think the biggest area of collaboration that people want to see is on vaccines. And right now, when we talk about whether or not Justin Trudeau will run against Jason Kenney, I think he's setting himself up to run against provincial premiers in general. We saw today Premier Ford in Ontario taking some shots at the federal government, sort of in response to criticism that Ontario has received on perceived delays in their vaccine rollout. Alberta, launched their scheduling, or the second, I guess it'd be phase 1B of the vaccination plan yesterday, where they opened up the portal for all Albertans 75 years or older. Ontario is not planning to do so for almost another 3 weeks. And of course, they're looking for someone to point to, and have gone to Trudeau. Prime Minister Trudeau has in the past couple of weeks taken some opportunities to try and put the pressure back on the provinces. In the end, the best way that they can coordinate, though, is getting vaccines into arms of Canadians across this country as quickly as possible. Whether or not they want to run against each other, they may not have to. If everyone's singing Kumbaya because they've got vaccines, then they can fight another battle.
Let's go to Sonia, and then we'll wrap it up with Michael. Okay, Sonia. Okay.
So on that topic, Monty, I think what I find quite interesting is that putting Justin Trudeau and Premier Kenney aside, Premier Kenney's ministers, his cabinet ministers, and their counterparts in Ottawa, in my opinion, work very well together. Over the last 2 years, there's been a new almost $1 billion investments in Alberta, whether it was infrastructure with the irrigation stuff recently, almost $1 billion between the ag ministers. There's been a lot of senior funding coming both from Ottawa and Alberta working together, and the big infrastructure with Minister Panda and Minister Catherine McKenna. Two individuals that you would never think would work together, but they seem to work really well together. And that kind of helps me sleep at night that, maybe Justin Trudeau and Premier Kenney don't get along on the surface in the media, but at least their cabinets do. And that's really important to remember.
All right, let's go to Michael. Michael, you're muted there.
Sure. So my colleagues have made some great points. I'll just say something maybe that differs a little bit. Yes, the Premier and the Prime Minister, certainly on the surface and in the media, are often sparring, but their offices do work well together. I know this for a fact. I know at least past Premier's office officials have worked really productively with the Prime Minister's office. Keith made a great point that the Premier and the Finance Minister and Deputy Prime Minister have a good relationship as well. But I don't think it matters. It plays really well to go after Ottawa in this province. Justin Trudeau is not popular here. I think that he has worked in good faith to support Alberta, on orphaned wells, TMX, and a host of other files. But it doesn't matter. He's not popular here. Remember the last election, part of the Premier's election strategy was to point to the close ties between Rachel Notley and Justin Trudeau, and it worked. And he's not any more popular now than he was in 2019, in the last federal election, nor in the federal election as well. So I think Premier will run against Justin Trudeau. I don't think it will happen the opposite.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. We appreciate everyone participating, and certainly to our audience. Thanks so much for your great questions and for your attention over the last hour and 3 minutes. We're over time. Also want to thank Charles Bird and the team at Earnscliffe for helping us put this together. Our great partners at Earnscliffe spread across the country. Folks, we appreciate you being with us today, and certainly keep your eyes open. We'll be saying more about the budget in the hours ahead. So watch for that arriving in your email boxes in many cases. And other than that, we wish you a safe weekend, and please stay safe, and we'll see you very soon. Thanks so much, and all the best.